Oye, hay gente que
Sí.
quiere entrar en el... Ah, no, waiting room.
Sí. Yo cacho que la abro, no me la voy a
Sí, abre la waiting room. La waiting room.
Pero como
en vivo. Y vamos a meter todo. Vamos a... Porque vamos a quitar la waiting room, ¿ya? Para que entren todos. Total, no hay sonidos al entrar. Así que está transmitiendo bien eso. Estamos acá. Vamos de nuevo hasta acá.
Coño, que gente que quiere entrar en el...
Ah, ya estamos en YouTube. Sí. Súper rápido. Súper.
Ahora puedes volver al Zoom.
Yeah. Zoom is open. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just make sure
Everyone
my
who wants
computer
to.
doesn't
Yeah.
fall.
It's okay. Your computer.
Yeah, I just want.
Do you have any pointer?
I have a pointer. See if it works.
And we are. Does it work?
I use the pointer here, I think.
Yeah. Super. We are
No lo vamos a poner.
van a ver que además de la
Así como me pasa que cuando tengo que tener información. Sí,
Buenos días, mi nombre es Sergio Silva, soy el director de la Fundación Puerto de Ideas y quiero darle la bienvenida a esta conferencia de Anna Christina Nobre. Esta actividad se realiza en el marco del programa de educación y extensión del Festival Puerto de Ideas Valparaíso 2022, con el cual estamos desarrollando cerca de 30 actividades en diferentes comunas de la región, como Algarrobo, Concón, Olmué, Quillota, Quilpué, San Felipe, La Ligua, Viña del Mar y Valparaíso. Anna Christina es académica de Oxford y directora del Brain and Cognition Laboratory de la Universidad de Oxford. Además, es catedrática de Neurociencia Cognitiva Translacional y dirige el Centro de Oxford para la Actividad Cerebral Humana y es profesora becaria del St. Catherine's College. A nombre de la Fundación Puerto de Ideas, quiero agradecer especialmente a la Universidad de Valparaíso y a su Centro Interdisciplinario de Neurociencia por esta oportunidad, a sus académicos, estudiantes y a todo el público presente. Muchas gracias.
A nombre del Centro Interdisciplinario de Neurociencia Valparaíso, como director del centro, Juan Carlos Sáez, para mí quiero expresar que es un gran honor tener a un speaker de tanto peso en ciencia como es Anna Christina Nobre, y quiero agradecer también a Puerto de Ideas que nos hayan dado la oportunidad de compartir esta oportunidad de tener aquí en este auditorium y nos pueda dar una presentación no solo para los académicos, sino que para los estudiantes. Es un gran privilegio entonces para nosotros y quiero agradecer de antemano lo que estoy seguro que va a ser un tremendo inspiración para todos nosotros. Así que muchas gracias, Kia, y el escenario es para ustedes.
Gracias, Sergio, y gracias, Juan Carlos. Hablo en inglés. I'm sorry. I am Brazilian by birth, but I have studied all my life in English, and I've lived in the English-speaking countries for more than 40 years. So my Portuguese is very rusty, and my Spanish, even my Portuñol, is a little bit rusty. You can also blame my husband because he's Italian, and my Portuñol used to be very good until I met him, and then it got all a bit confused. I will try to speak a little bit slowly, but sometimes I get very excited. So if I start going too fast, if people just tell me to slow down, I'll remember to slow down. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I've had really some magical encounters with amazing, cultured, interesting people here in this beautiful city. Of course, I know of your center here, which is a really interesting interdisciplinary center in neuroscience. So it's a special pleasure for me to be able to come and share some ideas on a sunny Monday morning. Monday mornings are never very good, but hopefully can help it get the week to a good start. Okay, hopefully this will all work. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some very basic foundational aspects of human neuroscience, which is really about how we put together our perception. Most of our textbooks are still, and actually most of our intuition, sort of tell us the story of perception as something like this, where we have certain types of stimulation out in the world, pressure sounds, photons, molecules of smell coming in through our senses. We extract some features from them. We integrate those features into some objects. there's maybe some specialization in the brain for extracting information of different types of objects. We put those together into like a context or a scene like I'm experiencing now. And ultimately, some of those will end up in our memories, either over the short term and some of our memories over the lifetime that we can cherish. But as we have considered for a very long time, this is only really part of the story. And in fact, perception does not just start from the outside in, but it also takes place from the inside out. So our representations in the brain, as we're extracting the objects and scenes and our memories of a little time ago to lifetimes ago, they all feed back, and they sometimes are proactively put into the brain in order to make sense and to be able to complete this act of perception. This is not a new idea. So some of these ideas have been around for a long time, and I'll just give you two examples of scientists who I particularly admire and like, who have expressed some of these notions before. So Hermann von Helmholtz, for example, talks about the importance of memories in guiding and shaping what we actually sense and perceive in the world. And he says, reminiscences of previous experiences act in conjunction with the present sensations to produce our perceptual image. And William James, who was sometimes accredited as being the establisher of psychology in the United States, of modern psychology, says then that we have this organic adjustment, an ideational preparation or pre-perception that is concerned in all of our attentive acts, which then shape what we extract from the world. So this process of anticipating, prioritizing, selecting, preparing information coming out in our perception is what we sometimes call in the field, it's not a great word, but we call this the topic of attention. And people talk about our perception as being limited. And sometimes you read in textbooks people saying things like, oh, you know, we only have a few resources in our brain and the world is so vast and there's so much information that the brain cannot cope with all this information. So we talk about limits of resources or limits in the capacity of the brain. And these sometimes are sold to us as theories, but really it's just a redescription of the problem. It's more useful to really consider the design principles of the brain and understand how they pose a challenge for perception. So what we know about, for example, the visual system is that information is not extracted and then put together in a serial one by one step, but many things are happening at the same time. And this is a diagram of the many different visual areas of the brain and the connections between them. This is an old diagram. There's a newer version. It's basically about the same thing. So the brain is extracting information about colors and motions and shapes and patterns in all these areas in parallel, concurrently at the same time. And it ultimately has to bring the relevant parts together to build a cohesive experience. So there is this problem of this multiple things happening at the same time. And even if we focus on one brain area, for example, this is an area, is a schematic of an area sort of towards a high level processing in the visual system known as IT. If we look at this one area, we have a population, many neurons that are also processing information there at the same time. And indeed, if we look at one specific neuron in this area, what we see is that in some visual areas, these individual cells that have these receptive fields or sensing fields for vision, they actually have a very large catchment area. They have a very large field or receptive field from which they extract information. And so if a cell receives a catchment area like this, it if its activity, what is it going to represent? The grape, the orange, the apple, is an average of everything? How are we going to extract the bits that make the relevant pieces out of this? So these are the problems for perception, that we have a lot of information processing happening at the same time. This is distributed within many brain areas, within many cells. And in these cells, all the different objects compete for what the cell will signal. And all of this then requires later on, if the cells pick up the right pieces, for us to reintegrate and select the right bits and put them together for us to make some sense out of the world. And as I mentioned to you, this process of anticipation, prioritization, selection is sometimes referred to, or we refer to it as attention. And that is considered to be at least part of the brain's solution to this challenge of perception. So I'm going to give you the textbook version of attention, and then we're going to move beyond to some more interesting contemporary views that we have been developing. So the idea in attention is that we have the world, information from the world, and all the different aspects of the world are competing for the signaling, for example, in these individual cells, so that they ultimately can pick up sensible things and put them together. And what the cell picks up, as I said, if it picks up the average of this, it doesn't signal anything. So if the cell is able to prioritize or select some parts of it, it would be more informative. And there are two main forces that people consider influence what a neuron will respond to. One is the natural salience or importance of objects that the brain has evolved to pick up over evolution. So, for example, things that are very bright or loud or fast or big or transient, those things automatically will receive prioritized processing in these cells. But in addition, especially as humans, we are also able to influence what we want to pick up from the world, depending on what's important and relevant to us at a given time. And these are known as top-down biases, top-down modulation of how we pick up information from the environment. So we have these bottom-up natural evolutionary biases, these top-down sort of volitional, what we want, our goals influencing perception. And it's proposed that there's a network of brain areas that is involved in picking up salience, importance, what we want to do. And those are the areas that are influencing this top-down processing of information. So this is the textbook version of part of the solution to perceptual challenge. And we know a lot about this. And in fact, my lab has done a lot of work on this as well. And I'll show you some examples. So in terms of top-down biases, for example, we can use focus on spatial locations, but we can also use things like features of objects that are relevant to us to prioritize that information in brain areas. And we do this through a network of brain areas, which, as I talked about in my lecture in the Puerto de Ideas, actually looks very similar to the network that is responsible for actually moving our behavior and moving our eyes around in the world. So this entirely mental function of being able to focus on important things builds on some simpler sensory motor networks in the brain. So we have this big network that looks like this network that has been proposed by Marcel Messelem here with some areas in parietal and frontal cortex and also in subcortical areas. We know that information coming in from a sensory stimulus, if we record activity from the brain, has a different response. The same exact stimulation will have a different response from very early on, depending on whether it is of relevance, important to you or not. So this is just, for example, a trace showing the signal coming in through the brain that we can record from humans non-invasively, showing that even the earliest responses are changed depending on the importance of a stimulus to you. We then know that, so the idea is that this network is controlling visual area. Is there a way for me to... Thank you. So the idea is that this network has these top-down modulatory influences on visual processes, auditory processes, which then result in this modulation. And indeed, in the last 20 years or so, we and others have shown indeed that if you interfere with activity in this network, we actually modulate activity in visual cortex. So we've demonstrated this top-down influence in humans, and this echoes work done in animals showing exactly how this is done at the cellular level. And most interestingly, we can also watch the brain in a state of anticipation. So we can record activity from the brain when someone is anticipating, waiting for some stimulation that is either relevant or irrelevant to them. And we can show, for example, that the rhythms in visual cortex adapt to change the excitability of visual areas to things that are coming from the interesting part of the visual field. And using other methods like magnetic resonance imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, we can show that areas that are involved in perceiving a stimulus, for example, if you're asked to press a button and detect every time you see a cross like this, even when you're not seeing anything, there's just noise on this on the screen, but you're expecting to see that X. Those areas in visual cortex that would respond to that X stimulus are elevated. So they're prepared to act as soon as the visual information hits them. So this is the textbook notion of attention, where we have these top-down signals. We've identified this control network. We see that it modulates visual processing. We can watch, we can record or image the brain in anticipation, and we think, wow, that's amazing. So this is an amazing story, but it's really only part of this really fundamental work that attention has to do. So over the last too many years, my lab has been sort of working on one, sort of describing all this network of attention, as I've just shown you now, but also to incorporate two fundamental things that are missing from this picture. One is memory, as we saw from Helmholtz, this idea that memories are also important in shaping what we see. And the other one is time. So even though everything about attention in the real world is about dynamic anticipation, changing what's interesting to you moment to moment, modulating things, what I showed you is a very static picture, like a snapshot, like a photograph of what a system might look in a steady state. But if it doesn't take into account the fact that the world is always changing, and our motivations and our interests and our goals are also changing all the time. So over the last few years, I've been putting together this different framework, which I'll share with you today. So this is more or less an illustration of what the attention literature is like. It says, okay, we have stimulation coming in from which we build perception, and we have some goals that we keep in our working memory, in our short-term memory, our current goals, and these modulate information processing. So this is the standard network that I just told you about. And what we've been showing over the years is that actually it's not just our goals, but there are many sort of really basic sensory things that are feeding back into the processing, but also all of our memories from a long lifetime of experience also are there and are changing the way we interact with things. And then we also showed that this happens dynamically in time, and I'm going to show you some of this today. And in addition, we also suggest that these arrows, if we can call them, of attention, they don't just work from our memories to perception, but they also act on our memories. So at any given time, I may prioritize which memories I want to interact with and which memories are more important to me, ultimately to help me guide my behavior. So this is creates a virtuous circle between our memories and attention. And this is there to prepare us adapt us to the world and prepare us to encounter possible likely futures that are going to occur. So in the sort of summary of this is that memory and attention, they work together. They link the past and the future to guide our adaptive behavior. And in my theoretical framework, memories can be considered that informational content that we use, and attention as those functions that prioritize and select the relevant signals to guide our behavior. So I'm going to talk to you mainly about this side of attention, but focusing on this dynamic aspect of attention. And if we have time, I'll also tell you a little bit about how we also select things in our memories. Okay. So as I mentioned, the sort of standard view of attention is this idea of prioritization and selection of relevant information to guide adaptive behavior. And I'm going to show you that it's dynamically and temporally structured. And in fact, there's all kinds of temporal information out in the world that the brain can pick up to use to prepare to perceive. So there are many, for example, associations or cues like the conductor, which signals things that are about to happen. There are rhythms, like in ping pong, like in walking, like many natural behaviors are very rhythmic. There are probabilities, so there are contexts in which things become more and more likely or less and less likely, or they change in probability. So I have the goalie here. The longer she's standing there, the more likely someone is to go and kick the penalty. But there are other situations, for example, if you are a football player and you've just committed a foul on someone, you will be expecting the judge to issue a whistle. But if it doesn't happen very soon, it's less and less likely to happen, and maybe you got away with your foul. And of course, there are many more complex things like real sequences in music and many other complex temporal structures, which the brain can learn and utilize and use to adapt our behavior. So indeed, we have kind of more or less pioneered or started the study of temporal attention, and we've now shown that there's all these different varieties of temporal structures. So, the general conclusion of what I will tell you is that these temporal expectations that we form, they work through many different mechanisms, and they can influence all different kinds of processing in the brain in order to depending on the context, in order to adapt behavior. So I'll show you some examples of how we go about doing this. So I'll show you some experiments. So the simplest experiment that we developed now, like the first study was published in 1998, was something where an individual has sees a cue, and the cue indicates whether a stimulus that they have to respond to happens after a short interval or after a long interval. So very similar. You just get a signal that says, okay, get ready for something soon, or get ready for something that happens a little bit later. And we manipulate these probabilities so that if you get a cue that says something will happen soon, 80% of the time it will happen soon. And 20% of the time, you got the wrong cue and it happens early. But time is very strange. So as time passes, if the target hasn't happened yet, it will always happen. So at the second interval, at the long interval, everything is equally likely to happen. So indeed, if people are responding in these cases, these are people, how long it takes people to press the button to detect their stimulus. They're much faster if they are anticipating the target happening at that time than if the target happens at that time, but they were anticipating it to happen later. So this shows that the brain is the system is adapting very quickly to this, and as I said, really it's the first interval that counts, because at this time everything is equally likely, and the brain can reorient attention and is ready in both cases then. So we demonstrated that temporal attention works. We identified the brain areas that do this. We also then, so we used fMRI and actually initially positron emission tomography, which was the predecessor to fMRI, and then fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to show the networks involved in this temporal orienting of attention. But we could also record activity by putting electrodes on people's heads, and we can show that after the cue, depending if participants were anticipating the target to happen after the short interval or after the long interval, the preparatory buildup activity also changes in magnitude, so that the peak of this preparatory activity happens at the time when the target is anticipated. So the brain is proactively doing this. Then we showed that so often in my field, in my research area, people are obsessed about finding the mechanism. And one of the lessons, or one of the things that we try to demonstrate in my lab, is that there are many mechanisms through which the brain can guide adaptive behavior. So for example, if we take this task that I just showed you now, and we give people a situation where they are using temporal information in order to prepare a left or a right hand response, or if they're using this temporal information in order to anticipate a stimulus on the right or on the left that they need to make a visual discrimination, we can see that the same temporal information can act through the different systems in the brain in order to guide adaptive behavior. So in this case, people received a left or a right arrow like this. So we had a left or a right arrow, but the color of the arrow indicated whether the target was likely to be short or long. But in some cases, it was a left or right hand response, and in other cases was a left or right visual stimulus. And when we do this, first of all, we can look at the consequences to behavior, and we can see that if you have a very simple task like this, your reaction time, this is in milliseconds, is very fast compared to a more difficult task. And you can see that if you have the right temporal information, remember, it's always the first short interval that really matters here. If you have the correct temporal information, you have a big advantage to your response time. But how good you are, how accurate you are, doesn't change very much because it's a very easy task. But if you have a difficult visual discrimination, you get a little bit of a response time benefit, but you get a very big accuracy benefit. So you're much more accurate at discriminating this. So you get different patterns of behavioral benefits. And then we can also look at how the brain uses this anticipatory information to prepare different systems. So here we recorded EEG, and we looked at those natural rhythms that exist in the motor and in the visual areas. And we see that when you have a cue that carries information about time, we can first of all map the motor excitability. But here, when you have a cue that's guiding your perception, you can see this more in the back of the head. You can see that if it's left or right, you can see that it's preparing visual excitability, these cues. And then if you add the temporal information of the cue, you can see that if the individual is expecting something short as opposed to something later, only the motor cortex changes in excitability just at the time before they're expecting the stimulus. So the brain changes the degree of preparation in the motor system in the right moment to guide adaptive behavior. When the information is relevant for vision, then this happens only in the visual system. Again, just at the time in anticipation of the visual stimuli appearing. So as I mentioned to you, so I hope that's clear to suggest that things happen sort of through different channels or different preparatory mechanisms in the brain. And as I mentioned to you, this kind of attentional modulation just doesn't happen just in terms of what's in your mind now, but also you can use your memories from longer time to bring these temporal expectations to bear. So this is a nice study that was done with André Cravo, who was a Brazilian visiting student at the lab at the moment. Now he has his own lab back in São Paulo, actually. And what André and Gustavo was another, this is a complete Brazilian project here. It's like Gustavo is also now in São Paulo has set up a Max Planck lab there. And what we did was we actually gave people we taught people temporal associations with scenes. So people saw scenes, every scene or picture was different. And in half of the pictures, there was associated with a target happening after a short interval. In the other half of the pictures or scenes, it was associated with a target happening late. And I tried to have a nice stimulus. I said, oh, let's have a butterfly or, you know, a nice firefly. And then the guys is like, no, let's have a salient stimulus. Let's have a bomb. So we have this situation where in some scenes, maybe I'll do that again, the scene appears, you get a placeholder, and the target is the bomb turning red, and people have to detect it, and they have to do it quickly, because if they don't do it quickly enough, the bomb goes boom. So you have to deactivate the bomb quickly. But in other cases, the scenes were associated with a placeholder and then the bomb happening much later. So you either had short or long temporal associations, and incredibly, people had never really studied this kind of temporal association in long-term memory. People study what order things happen in, but actually the memory for the specific temporal interval is something that's not been studied very much. So we first had to demonstrate that people could do this, that they could learn over the blocks. They had several blocks in which they went through all the scenes, and each time they went through the scenes, they got better and better at doing this. They got faster and faster. And when we asked them, you know, is this scene associated with a short or a long interval? After a little bit of training, they were better than chance, but by the end, they were very good at this. So we were able to show that people can remember these temporal associations. And then we asked, do these temporal associations then help? So we had in the following day, we had a task where the scene appeared and the target then appeared either at the correct remembered time or at the other time, which was not compatible with their memory. And we did 2 of these experiments. I'm just showing you the results of one. So they both showed similar results. So again, people are faster, for example, at the short target when they're anticipating it to happen short than if something happens short and they were expecting it to happen long. But interestingly, in long-term memory here, you see effects even for the long item. So this is suggesting that there might be a different mechanism for long-term memories to influence or to use timing to adapt their behavior. And we also see that the quality of their performance, their accuracy-related judgments improve as well. So they're faster and they're more accurate at doing this task. In this task, what happened is that the bomb either turned green or blue, and they had to make a discrimination. So they were better at doing that discrimination if the item happened at the right time. Again, we can record brain activity here. And this is really interesting because here in the task, first you get the scene, then you get this placeholder, and then you get the target. But here you can see that at the time the scene appears, before even the placeholder starts, the brain starts preparing differently depending on the timing of that target that's associated with it. So you get this bigger preparation based on whether you are anticipating something happening after the short or long interval. So this is a potential known as the CNV, contingent negative variation, and you can see that it's significantly altered depending on whether you're expecting. So the target hasn't happened yet. It's the expectation of the target happening either after a short interval or a long interval. And we see that when we compare how well people learn in this task, we can see that the better they learn in the task, the better their benefits, the bigger their benefits later in this attention task. We see that the better they learned, the bigger the brain effect. And we see that the bigger the brain effect, the faster their response time. So this suggests that our memories are also sometimes carrying information about the timing of things. So I'm sure if you are like a dancer or someone like that, you've known this forever because you anticipate exactly when things are supposed to happen and your brain is not reacting to things, it's preparing all the time before anything happens. Okay, so all of these illustrations that I gave you are really about cues, associations. I give you a cue and then something happens. But I want to show you that there are different ways in which this can happen. I'll try to show just a couple of examples. One of which is like is just looking at sort of the temporal rhythm of things. So in this task, sorry, I don't have a good I didn't make a demonstration of it, but people are looking straight at the center. A little ball appears on the screen and then it moves across the screen, and then it disappears behind a occluder, a white occluder band, and then it reappears at the end and it has a little dot in it or not. And this is the discrimination that people have to do. They look straight at the center, but when this thing appears after the occlusion, they have to say yes, no, whether there's a little dot in the center. And sometimes the ball moves like this and moves in a straight trajectory and also with a constant rhythm. So every 600 milliseconds or so. Sometimes it moves in a straight trajectory, but the rhythm is all broken. So you have spatial information, but no timing information. Sometimes the ball moves in a rhythm, but it jumps all over the place. So you don't know where it's going to show up, but you know when. And sometimes everything is messed up, so you don't know where and you don't know when exactly. If you do this and you get people's reaction times, their response times, you can see that if they have either space or time, they're faster than if they have neither. And if they have both, they're a little bit better. Okay, so behaviorally, people are picking up on these regularities. They're just happening on a trial-by-trial basis in a natural way through these rhythms. And then we can record activity, how the brain responds to this target, depending on whether it was correctly anticipated in space, in time, or in both space and time, compared to if you had a neutral baseline where you don't have any expectation. Okay, now I'm going to skip this one for a moment and just see. If you know where something is going to happen, that first visual response, even though this is a every time shifting trial task and stuff, the brain picks up this information just over a couple seconds and is able to anticipate in space where the target will happen. And we can see that the response to this target here on the right changes excitability in the visual cortex that's processing it, which is on the other side, on the left, because the brain crosses the visual information like that. But if we have both space and time, the effect is much bigger. So this effect of spatial attention is magnified a lot if the brain also knows the timing of the stimulus. So the temporal information is combined with the other information about what the brain is expecting in order to maximize how it processes the stimulus. Interestingly, in this study, if all you know is time, but you don't know where something is going to happen, that is not enough to have an early visual response. It has lots of other effects later on, but the very early visual response was not affected. So then, so this was done with a master's student in my lab. Many years later, Gustavo, who I already told you about, also, when he came to the lab, we reran a different version of very similar experiment. But now we were really interested in what happens when the brain is in a state of just anticipation. So before I told you about the response to this stimulus, but now I'm going to show you the response of the brain when nothing is happening on the screen, but where the person either is expecting where something will happen, or whether they're expecting where and when something is going to happen. And the question is, does the brain use this temporal information dynamically, proactively, to anticipate what's going to happen in a temporally structured way? So what we did is we just looked during this period of occlusion here, just at the white band. So there's nothing on the screen. Sorry that there's a red dot here. And in this task, what happened is there was one last jump. There was an invisible step behind the occluder. People did not see this, and then it reappeared again. And we were able to measure those natural rhythms of the visual system in the brain during that period. And the natural rhythm of the visual system happens at between 8 and 12 hertz in the alpha band. And the more it goes down, the more excitable the visual area is. So, and this is what we actually could record during this period, during the occluder. So what happens is, again, it happens only in the natural visual rhythm, which is 8 to 12 hertz. We showed that there's nothing else modulated in the brain at that time. And you can see that when nothing is happening, the level of excitability in the brain is going up and down, as if it's continuing that temporal rhythm of temporal expectation in this period of waiting when nothing is happening in the brain. Okay, so we've done lots of other experiments showing effects of rhythms and things like that. So I'm going to show you now sequences. So this is an interesting task where people have just 4 buttons, and on the screen, they see one of 4 stimuli, and they just have to follow along. They see the left stimulus, they press this button, hand, the right, and then they just follow the same pattern that they see on the screen with their hands. And without the participant knowing, we can create a sequence of how these stimuli appear. So there's a repeating sequence of 12 items that happen. Okay, and actually, if you ask people, they don't remember the sequence, they don't know, but you can sort of do that as if you're kind of, without knowing, kind of learning a piano piece, for example, of a sequence of 12 items. This is something that had been done a lot before. This is called the serial response time or serial reaction time task. What we did is we say, okay, we can have spatial sequences. What about temporal sequences? I'll show you in a bit. So if you have just the spatial sequence, and people doing it over and over and over, you see that their reaction time gets a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster. And these gray bar here is when you change to a new sequence. So it's not that people are just getting warm on the computer, it's a sequence specific effect, because if you change the order of things, then they're worse. Okay, so this is the typical SRT effect that everybody has done before. So we asked, what about time? So we created temporal sequences where these 4 intervals were repeated in a series of 12. And if people only have the temporal intervals, but they don't know which finger it goes with, they just have a temporal sequence, they don't seem, so this is the red line, they don't seem to learn very much. So their reaction time just kind of stays about the same. But if you put the 2 sequences together, the spatial sequence and the temporal sequence, these are 2 completely different sequences. So it's not that one interval corresponds to one finger. It's a completely different 12-item sequence of time, 12-item sequence of fingers. You put them together, and this is the effect you get. It's a huge effect. So here, again, when the brain knows something about what it's expecting in the world or what it has to do, and it also has timing, it can prepare to do that in a much, much more efficient way. Okay, so this is just to show that the brain is proactively using temporal information through cues, through rhythms, and through sequences. We've also done a bunch of, maybe I'll just show you, I'll just stretch your patience for a little bit more. We've done this also recording activity in the brain, very similar tasks. This is people learning the sequence. This is a both spatial and temporal sequence. And then in this period here, we record activity in their brain. And these red ones is when we shift to a different sequence to show that they have learned the gray sequence here. We can record, now you're an expert about natural rhythms and motor cortex and visual cortex. So here we're focusing on the motor cortex, and we can see the activity here above the motor areas in the brain. And we look at the activity after one interval, a medium interval, depending on whether people are anticipating something to happen soon or happen later. And again, in these natural sequences, we see that the brain, this is the natural motor rhythm. If it's anticipating something happening soon, it really turns on that, and this is the time here where the short target would happen, and this here is where the long target would happen. So here, if you're anticipating something short, you really turn on your motor cortex excitability. If you're anticipating something long, you don't do that so much early on. And if you compare the difference between them, you can see that even before any target appears, the motor cortex is more ready if something is going to happen at the short interval. If you look at this for the new sequence that people don't know, they haven't learned, they don't have any anticipation, then the brain just prepares a lot no matter what. So if anything, the brain learns to be lazy when it doesn't have to prepare something so soon. So again, it's this idea of using timing. So hopefully this gives you an idea that this act of attention is dynamic. It's happening also in time. It happens across many different types of memories, not just short-term memories, but also long-term memories. I think I want to show you maybe just one example how, for example, this also happens when we are able to change our attention back in to select and prioritize things in our memory. And I'll show you this study, which I quite like, by Freek van Ede, who was a postdoctoral research fellow in my lab and has his own lab in his home country in the Netherlands. So in this task, people see two colored bars with specific orientations. These change every trial. They have different orientations, and the orange and the blue bar change location on a trial by trial basis. So you see these two things, they go away. Now they only exist in your head. They're gone from the scene. They exist in your head. At some point, you're going to be asked to report one of them. So you get this thing, which is which we call a probe, that asks you, okay, what is the orientation of the orange thing? So people see this, they have to make a decision. They say, yep, I know the orientation. They press a button, and then they have to rotate these little dots so that they match the orientation in their memory. But so the trick that we played here is that sometimes you were asked about the orange stimulus, sometimes you were asked by the blue stimulus, but we manipulated when you were likely to be asked about the orange or the blue. So for example, in this case, if this stimulus happens after the first interval, short interval, you're very likely to be asked about the orange one. If time passes, nothing happens, but you're asked later, then you're very likely to be asked about the blue. So the important thing is nothing happens until the probe. So, you either get a probe early or you get a probe late. As I said, we give you a moment to think about your response. When you're ready, you say, yeah, I'm ready. We count that as your decision time. And then after you say that, you have to be very quick to report the orientation. And then we can also see how well you reproduce this item. So if we do this task, the question is, first of all, can the brain prioritize things in your head, which is something that hadn't been demonstrated until we showed this like about 20 years ago now. But now in these kinds of studies, can it do it dynamically in time, just based on the own experience of passage of time? Can you first prioritize the one that's likely to happen early and then shift and prioritize the one that's likely to happen late? And that's what we see. So if we look at decision times or the response times, people are much faster at the early probe if they were anticipating to be probed about that stimulus than about the other. But this kind of settings in the brain are not fixed, because as time moves and now the other one is more likely, then now you're much better at reporting the other one much faster, and you're worse at reporting the one that you would have been good at before. And we see this with reaction times and decisions, but we also see this with the amount of precision with which you are able to report this item. So your brain can go back and select which bits of your memories are relevant at a given time to improve your performance in this task. And again, we can measure the activity in your brain as it's going on. And we measure here what happens when you prioritize a visual stimulus in your head is that also taps into those natural visual rhythms. It uses the visual cortex to bring back some of that information. And we showed that it does this in time so that the excitability of the correct visual cortex is higher at the time that you're anticipating that stimulus. And this is the effect that we have here, the degree of how much the left versus right visual cortex is excitable, depending on whether you're going to report something on the left or the right of your visual memory. And the more the alpha is down, which is higher excitability, the faster your reaction time. And this shows that the visual modulation in the brain correlates on a trial by trial basis on your performance on this task. Okay, I'll show you one last study, which is a similar study to this one, which is very crazy study. Okay, so the logic is the same as what I showed you before, but I still find these results unbelievable. They're believable because we replicated them like 4 times in this one paper and have replicated it since, but they're crazy. So in this case, we have people see the same kind of idea. They see 2 stimuli. They have orientation, and they're going to have to report the orientation of one or the other. Okay. And here, the interesting thing is that one of the stimuli is dark and the other stimulus is light. Okay, so you see these things. The dark and light has no importance whatsoever for the participant. All they have to do is report the orientation. So they get then a probe. The probe, if it's early, in this case, it's like, okay, we're going to ask you about the one on the left. Okay. If nothing happens, just like before, and you're probe late, you're going to be asked about the one on the right. Then when that happens, you get that cue, you say, yep, I'm ready, respond, decision time, and then we see the accuracy that you have. Okay? So just exactly the same, we get the same pattern of results that we saw with the other study, that people are faster, and in this case, they're more precise to report the item that they're expecting early than the item that they were expecting later on, and these priorities shift over time. But here, the crazy thing is that we actually measure people's eyes, okay? And what we showed is that actually the size of your pupil adjusts to which item you are selecting dynamically in your memory, okay? So the dark stimulus, if you were to encounter a dark stimulus, your pupil would dilate. And if you encounter a bright stimulus in the world, your pupil constricts. And this is what happens as you are dealing with dark and light stimuli in your head. So this is a plot that we have, and you can see that if you're anticipating the dark item to happen early, then your pupil is more dilated. And then here we plot, if you're anticipating the target happen late, then your pupil dilates to that. So it goes up and down, and we can watch your pupil dilating up and down in this way. So that's just some examples of how we can also orient attention back in our memories and dynamically in order to prioritize, select, and anticipate and guide our actions. So I hope you enjoyed sort of looking at how some of the attention field has moved on to incorporate memory and timing to guide our adaptive behavior. And this whole work of like how we orient attention back into our memories has also led us to view our memories as not really there for us to recollect and remember, but how it's there really for picking the right things to prepare things for us to come. So this is why we have this play with the word pre-membering. Instead of remembering, putting things together again in the past, we put things together for the future to guide our adaptive behavior. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has questions. I probably can just about understand questions in almost any language, but. No, everybody's baffled. Oh, okay.
I have a question. I'm wondering about, because in the real world, you have sensory information from many other auditory or
Yes.
smell, so, and in your studies just focusing one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is there are there like one of the sensory stimulus might be in a hierarchic position with respect to others in terms of modulation of responses?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So yes, all the studies that I've shown you are visual, and most of the studies I've done are visual, not all, but there are equivalent types of studies done in audition and in somatosensation across modalities. So the story is not just a visual story, there is a broader story. Sometimes people tend to, humans are very visual. Most humans are very visual. Actually, some friends of mine who do proper cross-cultural things say that's not true. It's just our own Western view of it. Some other populations are not so visual. But, we study vision a lot in neuroscience, in human and systems level neuroscience. So there's this idea that maybe some of these modalities are dominant. But actually, I think in the case of timing, which I study, the auditory cortex is probably, if anything, has a much bigger role to play. It's like, for example, just to understand language, the stress on the auditory system is enormous. So it has a much faster temporal resolution than vision. So I think in the real world, different senses have different roles to play. Many of these might be relevant to this idea of attention that I have, of prioritizing and selecting things in different ways. So I don't think there is one overall dominant sense, but I think it depends on the nature of the information. Interesting, inside vision, I think a lot of this orienting of attention in space, we have lots of different spatial maps that are associated with our actions. So for example, we have spatial maps linked to our eye movements, spatial maps that are linked to hand movements, but sometimes the retinal topic information seems to be very prevalent, and sometimes other things are mapped onto the retinal topic. But I don't think that there's necessarily just always a strict hierarchy of senses like that.
But probably that could be trained with the experience, because
yes,
the other time I hear someone that says something about how sort of the brain has been evolved in short time, because people use I don't know, more the computer, or maybe they are used a lot of video games, especially the young people. So maybe they are more focused on the visual changes.
And we can see that with in cases where people lose eyesight and things, there are the auditory systems kind of also change in their ability to pick up things. So there's a lot of plasticity and changeability in the brain, and people have studied, for example, the effects of certain types of action-based video games seem to improve certain aspects of focusing, of spatial visual attention. So it's changing all the time.
Do you think that our likeness of music has to do something with the brain being likely to be trained in the temporal patterns and temporal things? Do you think that?
Probably, yeah. I think, the rhythms of our language, the rhythms of music are tapping into, this is not a very definitive science yet, but there are a lot of people interested in the idea of how, the brain rhythms echo, well, actually probably the other way around, but the sensory stimulation that we encounter and that we experience echo some of the natural rhythms of systems in the brain. So, and there's really interesting studies about language comprehensibility, and we also have individual differences between our, my rhythms are probably much slower than yours. I have very slow rhythms, but so like the kinds of voices that if we could adjust how fast people speak and stuff, we kind of do that in synchrony with our own natural rhythms and things. So I think music, I don't think anyone has looked at music in the way that you are suggesting, but I think that's really interesting. I've thought about it a lot, like
and what about non-primate? Non-human primates or other cultures that have the Western music?
Yeah, so I don't know about that, the cultures, but a lot of the studies about these synchronizing sort of the world with rhythms, some of it is done in non-human primates. Is really powerful, interesting work in that regard. So I think it is, we basically experience what we can, what our machinery is kind of designed in time for. So, yeah, there's a question there. No? Oh, okay, yes.
Hi. Do you think that we could be trained in some kind of system to be more objective in visual experience and tending to be a more visual intelligence?
I think so. I mean, there's many ways in which I don't know exactly what you mean about being more objective, because there are lots of interesting strangenesses about our vision, right? So when I gave my talk the other day, I was talking about how we don't see very much that's going on around us. We have this sensation that we can see everything, but we really see the things that are of interest to us. And I also think it's a mirror. It's like, why do we have the sensation that we see everything? We have some kind of good enough fill in the blanks kind of method. So in that case, I think there are some hard limitations that really the system is designed to be goal oriented. So I think actually designing interfaces or maybe getting people to explore things systematically could help in that way. But, there are other types of illusions and other types of visual distortions that, we probably at least could become aware of and train some of them. Yeah.
Space and time will be related with mathematical processing. In this case?
Yeah, so I think on a superficial level, I'm going to say yes. But yeah, I think so. For example, there's some work by Stan DeHaan, who has made a lot of emphasis about the relationship between space and numbers. Whether that is enough to say, is this about mathematical processing? I mean, to me, being a novice mathematical person, I don't speak the language of true mathematicians, and I don't know what that is like, but I would imagine that is a very spatial, temporal, dynamic modulations, and for most of them. So at least at the basic neuroscience kind of investigations of like, there seems to be some things about numerosity and space and things, there's some connection. But I think one thing that happens a lot is that when people see similarities, they say, oh, it's all the same, and then I always like to think like, okay, there are some common principles here, but it's not the same, space is not the same as, so the differences are also as interesting as the fact that there's some commonality in it. So I'm kind of a yes, but kind of person. Yeah.
If I understood well, you relate the anticipation with the memory and learning, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So I work with mice and navigation spatial.
Mm-hmm.
When I put mice in a maze,
Mm-hmm.
the mice have to learn where is the goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the mice in this case help this navigation with the cue.
Mhm.
So the mice have to learn where to go. But when I put a cue in the goal, like a red, I don't know, red sign, the mice go directly to the goal because the mice go look the sign.
Mhm.
But this mice with the cue goal doesn't learn.
Mhm.
And the other when the mice have to pay attention to the cue of the landscape, the mice yes learn, but when the goal is signed, the mice no learn. So
Yeah.
this is like an anticipation because I put the sign to anticipate the goal of the in the mice.
Mhm.
But what's happened in this case?
Yeah, I think what happens is, I guess it's this idea, like there are many ways in which to guide adaptive behavior, right? So if you have a big cue, you don't need to do all the efforts of memorizing anything. And in fact, so the quality of memories and learning depends on how much you need that memory in order to perform the task in the future. So that's one aspect of it. But I would guess that, and this is people who do like maze studies and things, they often look at the learning behavior, but they sometimes don't look at like what's in the mouse's mind before they actually start going on the thing. And if you were to record that, and if they knew that they were in this condition or that condition, you would watch the mouse even before it starts in a different mental state, depending on whether it needs to use memory or whether it needs to use red, for example. So I think sometimes, this is a good example of like, we all study really closely related things, but our fields don't talk enough to each other for us to put it all together. So very few people who study learning and memory actually also look at attention factors in this. I mean, that's not true. I mean, there's some people do, but in general, it's not really big part of that literature, but it's important. And then there's also, of course, in all the mouse navigation studies, there's also these wonderful pre-play, right? So that is also a suggestion that the brain has that information and is putting it forwards before things are going. So I think those things are related, but this is part of the point that I'm making. Depending on the demands of the task, the brain prepares in really different ways. So there isn't one way to anticipate or prepare. Yeah, yes.
First of all, thank you for your talk. Some authors declare or state that attention and working memory are the same feature.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know your opinion and why.
Yeah, so I think one thing that most of us are quite poor at is really strong definitions and keeping to them. That's why in the way that I prefer to think about it, I consider memories as the informational content, and I consider attention as those functions that prioritize, select, output gating. And I think those two things work together, but I use those as very firm definitions in all of my work. But it is true that if you read about, everybody means something different about memory, attention, working memory. It's a complete mess. It would be wonderful if we could all get together and agree on some terminology. So it is true. So for example, a lot of the people who studied working memory, at some point, they realized the importance of attention in working memory, and they suggested that what you have in working memory is what you sustain attention on, and that is working memory. So even in that case, you can still think like one is the content and one is the function, which would still work for me. But what we have shown is that actually that's not necessarily true, because things go in and out of your, like, for example, in our study where you have first you prioritize this one and that one, and then you prioritize that one, you've lost the sustained attention on one before, but then it comes back. So what we're showing is that this idea of like necessarily constant sustained attention for working memory is not necessary, because attention can, the amount of prioritization and amount of activation can go up and down, and things can still live in your working memory and you can still pull them back. So there's a whole new field now looking at these other ways in which we can maintain information in working memory, not just through sustained attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. This is a very unusual question, probably. Personally, I think my working memory is better between 3 and 4 in the morning. When I wake up and cannot sleep.
You are a strange man, yes.
But many people share that experience that you can analyze things better and get better conclusions at that time of the night. I don't know if this is related to daytime or sleeping or whatever.
Yeah. There's so many factors that could. First of all, you are crazy. I don't share that. The only time I'm up 3 and 4 in the morning is somehow, I've been doing something very exciting or jet lag or yeah.
But you said it's very exciting when we're working in something in the lab.
Yeah.
You find the solution at that time.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. No, that used to happen to me when I had a good brain. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So there are lots of factors here. One is sleep, right? So sleep, if you have been sleeping and you wake up, a lot of the contemporary focus on sleep research is that we're using sleep to organize, put together, clean up, and consolidate those memories, right? So it continues to work on this material. So if you wake up in a lucky moment where that's been happening, it's all available or more active to you. So that's probably one aspect of it. Certainly the circadian rhythms are super important, and they're very understudied in connection to, at least in the human neuroscience. We know now people are beginning to study the importance of quality of sleep and stuff in terms of mental health disorders and stuff. But for the moment-to-moment cognition, this is not something that field hasn't really come together, which will be really interesting. And then the other thing is that I hope in your 3 o'clock in the morning, there's much less other distraction, right? Because there's a lot of competition between the outside world, the inside world all the time. So, if all of a sudden, it's a more just the internal space is more salient, then that also could help. So, okay. Okay, I think we've exhausted everybody. Time for, oh, no. Okay, final question, sorry.
What just you have used immersive technologies?
Yes, you know what? I'll show you what I didn't show you. Here's what I didn't show you. I'm very conscious of time. So we've run these studies in VR, for example. We have a lot of interesting VR studies. So we did the same, have to respond to one item or the other in VR. And then what happens in the laboratory situation is, you have a stimulus happens here, and then the stimulus disappears, which doesn't usually, nowadays it does happen in our world because most of us are in a digital world all the time, but it's not a natural thing that we evolved for. So what we did is we had this same kind of task that we normally do, but in VR, and either sorry, forget about this. I'll just, we either kind of rotate the room, or we get the person to rotate so that the things disappear. And we can show, again, by using eye movements, that when you rotate the room, you use the, okay, I'll put this without explaining anything, which is very annoying. But if you rotate the room, the people use the spatial frame of where things are in your head. But if you move like this, you use both this frame and that frame. So it suggests that there are multiple spatial representations that also can inform what we do. So the VR is amazing, and it really opens the potential for our work a lot. So yeah, thanks. Oh, more questions. Oh dear. Okay. No.
I know, yeah. Yes, no problem. Yeah. Oh, nice, thank you. It's a bit more difficult with VR, right? So we've been doing a lot of head tracking, eye tracking, and stuff, and we have been playing around with EG and VR, which is really
Right.
yeah. You neither, but yeah. So I've actually just ordered a little dry EG to play around with. Yeah, I have a friend who makes them, so he's gonna lend it to me.
Actually, if we want to, it's multivariate statistics.
If you want to send me an email, I have, there's a younger colleague of mine who's very interested in VR technology, statistics, stuff, and I'm sure it'd be really great to.
With Salvador, who's right, that is from New York. He is developing this models of cortex. They're quite detailed, and the fact is that he used it to train the brain interface. And the point is to connect this with
Yeah,
EEG
but
and
I think that this guy, Dan, would kind of know all the literature and point you in the right direction. If you want to send me an email, I'll just put you in touch. Yeah, that sounds really good. Tell me your name.
Yeah, I'm just starting my PhD on statistics.
Fun.
Yeah.
Last one.
Thank you very much. Very nice.
I'm gonna send you an email.
Yes, sir. Okay. I don't know, was it okay?
You had a little stop. I can tell that you had more.
I couldn't.
Yeah.
So I had to do it slowly. I hope it was comprehensible for.
Pero que le cambiamos de lado.
No, but there's several functions. One of
Yeah,
them is just to.
Yo tengo tu teléfono, así que eventualmente cuando ya te escribimos.
but I just know that a lot of people can go on ice and stuff. I mean, they might not know so much about it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I got in touch with Jesus
Uh-huh,
because in the area that I work with adults and children
uh-huh.
in visual art. And I'm going to.
I see, now I understand your question.
Yes.
Well, if you figure out how to do it, you have to teach me. Because
Yeah.
I really like to try to see, I love to paint and draw, but I don't
Yes,
have that
yes,
objective.
yeah. And
Term that.
I worked many years with entrepreneurs,
Uh-huh.
and that was a problem. That
Yeah.
you have to have a very objective vision on what the project is.
Yeah,
And so I had to work, because the history and the dedication of everybody
yeah, gets in the way.
get in the way, and they can't see the problem very objective.
Yeah, that's true.
You understood now
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. Thanks
you.
for coming.
Nice trip back. And
Yeah.
come back.
Yes, we will. We're
We
coming
hope
back.
so.
There are a lot of places.
That's the
You
plan.
must know more about Chile.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Thanks a lot.
Hi.
I just wanted to also ask if you have seen differences between the results of the experiments, between the use of VR environments and, I don't know, normal.
Yeah, we haven't tested that, but yeah, I think that's really interesting.
There must be some difference.
Yeah, of course, yeah, because, you know, we have in VR, for example, the whole vestibular system is not working properly, you know, you don't have the, so I think there are real differences in multisensory perception, but we haven't done the comparison. We probably should, actually, that would be an interesting thing to do. There is, there's an amazing work, and maybe you know it, in mice by Meta. Do you know him?
Yeah.
Meta, not the
Meta.
VR Meta, MEHTA. Do you know his work? So he has, you know, all that work in mice and rats and space cells, right? Spatial navigation and stuff. So he shows that, I'm trying to think now because he's it's very complex. He's done a lot of stuff, but he showed he can replicate place cells in some conditions of VR, but then sometimes if they kind of eliminate certain types of cues and stuff, the whole place cells all go away and they turn into something totally different. And it's really all about picking up feature correlations, and the environment has nothing to do with space. And that he can only show that because the VR removes the natural correlations that exist in a real world. And his argument is that all that place stuff is an artifact of the way our experience is in the real world, but is not what the cells are really coding. So if you're interested in differences of VR and stuff, so his last name is Meta, MEHTA. So he jokes because of course metaverse and stuff, but he's I don't remember his first name is
Which university?
he's at
He's from India.
he's from India, yeah, he's from India, but he's in he's at Los Angeles.
Yes, sorry. You are transmitting
Thank you.
all the conversation.
Thank you.